All right, so hello and welcome to all who have joined us today for this webinar series. It's titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is the sixth in our series so far. We have enjoyed hearing from a range of scholars over the past few months. This is a free webinar series. It's a year-long, actually 14. We have 14 of them. So it will meet here on Zoom monthly on different topics around post-qualitative inquiry and the doing of inquiry inspired by a range of post-philosophies. In each of the sessions, we involve one or two international guests and their students who have experiences with inquiry inspired by post-philosophies such as post-humanism, post-structuralism, affect theories, feminist new materialism, post-colonialism, just to name a few. I'm Candace Kuby, and I'm co-hosting this webinar with Viv Bozalek. The webinar series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between our universities started in 1986, and funding for this webinar series is provided from the committee that oversees our partnership. This committee supports academic exchanges between the University of Missouri System and UWC and provides opportunities for teaching and learning, research, and community engagement between our two universities. We are so very grateful for our university's very long time collaboration and support of this webinar series. These webinars are also available on YouTube. You can find them on the website if you would like to access them. So you can go to the webinar website and you'll find a link that will take you to the YouTube channel. Also on YouTube, you can select the option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar as well. And you can subscribe to the series so that you can get notifications as new ones are posted. We are also excited to share that the webinar series will become 2 special issues in the journal Qualitative Inquiry. So over time, our panelists will publish their webinar in an article format. So stay tuned for more information about that. And also we've updated the website with exact times for each webinar, as we had failed to take into account daylight savings times when we initially created the website. So please check the times posted next to each webinar as we continue to move forward this year. So today our panelist is Dr. Erin Manning. She is a research chair, speculative pragmatism, art and pedagogy, the director of interdisciplinary PhD in the humanities and Faculty of Fine Arts, and director of Sense Lab at Concordia University in Canada. So Erin, we are so thrilled to have you today. Welcome. Erin has several students joining us as well today. And so we're going to get to know them a little bit better later on in the webinar, but for a brief introduction, we have Halbe Kuipers here. See a wave. Mayra Morales and Diego Gil. So they will share about their experiences working with Erin on research projects, training and mentoring and writing together. So we welcome all of you here today and glad that the 3 of you could join us. And then also I'd like to introduce Erin Price. So we have 2 Erins today on the call. Erin Price is a doctoral student at the University of Missouri, where I get the pleasure of working alongside her. She's an artist and an art educator interested in the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters and becomings of identity and community. So I welcome Erin, as well as want to make note that she is the artist that created the art for the webinar. So if you look at our website, if you look at the videos that are on YouTube, she did the beautiful artwork for this webinar series. So thank you so much, Erin, and welcome.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Viv and Candace to you today. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. She's also an honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University, and she holds a PhD from Utrecht University. Her research interests and publications include political ethics of care and social justice, post-humanism and feminist new materialisms, and innovative scholarly practices in higher education. Her most recent co-edited books include Post-Humanism and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education and Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Post-Human and New Materialist Perspectives. Dr. Candace Kuby is an associate professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri. She's department chair and the director of qualitative inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She's the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, and her scholarship appears in journals including Qualitative Inquiry, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and Cultural Studies and Critical Methodologies. On behalf of myself and the many people that I've interacted with, had the privilege of interacting with during the course of this webinar series, I just want to extend a big thank you for making this really productive space for all of us to be a part of.
Thanks, Erin. So to all of our attendees today, you might have noticed that we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of the meeting platform in order to allow for a larger number of people to attend. So just to clarify, only the host and the panelists have video and audio functions during the webinar. As we've mentioned before, please use the chat box. Feel free to introduce yourself. This is a place for you to connect, to pose comments, get to know other people who are on the webinar today. So that will be open the whole time for people to be able to interact. As we mentioned, we are recording this webinar. It's for public viewing later on YouTube. And we're going to ask as we move into the question and answer section toward the end of the webinar that you find or locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This is going to make it easier for myself and Erin Price to moderate the questions. If we have questions pop up in the chat box, those will get kind of unwieldy for us to have to scroll through the chat and the Q&A place. So feel free to go ahead and post questions throughout the whole webinar today. And when we get to the Q&A part, Erin and I will scroll through the Q&A box and moderate questions from that location. So the structure of the webinar today is as follows. Viv will be our lead interviewer today, and she'll focus a conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes with Erin. And then we'll open up a space for Erin's students to also engage in dialogue with Viv and Erin. And then after that, we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes at the end for us to spend time taking questions from those who are here from the Q&A part of the webinar. So let's see, Viv, you want to go ahead and do our introduction of Erin and jump right into our questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to say a little more about Erin. I'm sure most of you who are here actually know about her. But she's the research chair in speculative pragmatism, art and pedagogy, as Candace told you, in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. She's also the founder of the famous Sense Lab now. It's a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy through the matrix of the sensing body and movement. And a 3 Ecologies Institute that's newer, I think. She's a collaborator in that. Her artworks tend to explore more than human participatory ecologies, and she's had exhibitions in many cities, including Sydney, Moscow, New York, Vancouver, Montreal, Berlin, and Bucharest. Her publications include several books, such as her new one, For a Pragmatics of the Useless, and then the Minor Gesture, chapter of which we read for this webinar, called Against Method. Always More Than One, Individuation's Dance, Relationscapes, Movement, Art, Philosophy, and with Brian Masumi, Thought in the Act, Passages in the Ecology of Experience. We're so pleased that you could join us, Erin. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and as you know, I've been reading your scholarship over time, and I've also seen you present at conferences, mainly on video, I must say. And then had a chance to interact with you with Nikki Romano, who responded to your keynote presentation at the New Materialism Conference that you kindly agreed to do a keynote on. And I was delighted when you chose your keynote, which has now been published in Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning, as one of your papers. So I hope that we're going to have a generative conversation and thought-provoking one, and for all of us here. both yourself and all your students and the participants. And I'm going to go through the questions that we generally ask, and then I'll ask more specific questions about your work. So the first general question is, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry?
Yeah, thank you. Just thank you for this honor. And I want to say that students is an odd term, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think most of us would say, I mean, they're really co-conspirators and people I learn from and you know, that we journey with. So it's also such a gift to give us the opportunity to think together. And in our case, because we work together around Sense Lab and 3 Ecologies, we really are always thinking about how to think differently in the university, but also in excess or outside it. And so I think that your question, Viv, is very much aligned to that. For me, philosophy has nothing to do with the university. I mean, I never forget that we get doctorates in philosophy. I'm always aware that there is a kind of legacy in the university in the way that it positions philosophy as having value, a certain kind of value, as a mobilizer of knowledge. At the same time, I know that in the last 100, 200 years, as universities have siloed into disciplines, that philosophy has become itself a discipline. So it's shifted from a kind of platform for thought to a more disciplinary organization of thought. Saying that, though, I don't want to act like the university was an ideal place. You know, 200 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to be there, and nor would you. So, you know, we have to be clear about that problem. But what interests me about philosophy is that it is very much what children do. The very first questions that children ask are philosophical questions. And I always, when I say that, I think of our son who asked his father when he was about 3 or 4, whether his red shoes were immortal. And living with a philosopher father, I always thought that Jesse had a true question about whether his red shoes would live forever, but also understood that the way to push bedtime was to get a philosophical question asked right then. So I say all these things because that's really how I think of philosophy, is that force that moves us in and out of bed every day, is that environment of curiosity that allows us to ask unanswerable questions, that pushes thought to places where we're edgy and excited with what we know and what we don't know. And so for me, in my own work, you all know there's a question that gets asked when we publish a book, which is, who's going to read this? And I always think, well, I hope I don't know who's going to read this. I hope that somebody reads this who didn't know they were a philosopher and finds their way to thinking through it. So I don't know, that's a kind of broad sense of where philosophy is.
Yeah. You refer to process philosophy a lot in your books, and maybe you could just elaborate a little on that and how it's important for you.
Yeah, so I'm a trained philosopher, which means that my actual academic degrees are in that area. And so my background is not in process philosophy. My background is in continental philosophy, and I worked with Heidegger and Derrida, I mean, on their work. But I had this moment as a graduate student where I was really separating out my philosophical, political work from my artistic work. And at the time I was working with Derrida, and he said to me that he really felt I was asking process philosophy questions. And what I understood him to mean was that the questions I was asking were not questions at the level of representation. They were not questions about systems that had already formed themselves, but rather about processes underway. It took me quite a long time from that realization to move into a sort of deeper understanding of what process philosophy is, which I would always connect to Alfred North Whitehead and his book Process and Reality. What I would say is that process philosophy is a philosophy of movement and change that asks where creativity happens in the world. And what is particularly important for me with process philosophy, which I would now sort of organize around a lineage that included thinkers like Spinoza and Bergson, and moved all the way up into Deleuze and Guattari in the contemporary moment, and so many extraordinary women thinkers in the contemporary moment. I would say, and Black studies, a lot of Black studies as well. I would say that what process philosophy allows us to do is to ask the questions of life from a non-human perspective. And I prefer to call that a more than human perspective, because it's not about object versus human. It's about really pushing the question of where the human begins and ends, and allowing for an encounter with the world that is ecological or relational.
Yeah, it's a wonderful summary, I must say, which sort of pertains to our next question, which is what does this philosophy make possible? I know you use the word inquiry, and it might sound strange, but in South Africa we use inquiry. So I'm going to stick to the South African version, if you can bear with me. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I don't teach in philosophy, as I think you know. My position in the university is in studio art. As an artist, I'm interested in really maybe showing people that the work they do is proto-philosophical. I'm not interested in those narratives of education that make us always lacking, that make us feel as though we're missing the tools to do the work. I'm really interested in the opposite, which is to say, I'm interested in the ways that we've honed intuitions in different matrices that have their own rigors. And I'm interested in pulling out those forms of rigor and giving us a collective confidence to articulate them, whether it's in language or in material practices or in gardening or whatever practices feel vital. So I think that for me, the question really always eclipses the valuative the valuative predicament of the university or school, to ask how we can give each other the tools that extend beyond the classroom so that we can continue to ask questions that push us. In order to do that, what feels very important to me is that we refuse the normative critique. And we move into what I've called, with others, I didn't invent this term, imminent critique, which is pulling from knowledge from the inside to ask what it is doing, rather than accusing each other of not having done the work that we feel we should have done. And so in a way, it's a kind of generosity to say, look, it's not about you or I not having adequately read the canon, but rather it's about understanding why and how you've read what you've read or done what you've done, and then hopefully feeling curious enough to extend that.
Yeah, that's lovely. But I'm not, as you say, I'm not so sure that this sort of work is valued by the institution, by higher education. And I mean, we have to exist there, continue to write research proposals, to talk about, you know, what we're going to be doing. And in reading your work, it sort of mitigates against doing things like that. So I'm just wondering how you survive there, and, you know, whether you have to do something different in order to get research funding, or whether people are accepting now, you know, of different forms of valuing and more affirmative ways. And, you know, everything that you talk about, I mean, which is unconventional in terms of research and what is required.
Yeah, you know, that's the key question, isn't it? No, it's not easy. And but what I would say, I just want to give a little anecdote, because you're part of the anecdote, and I hope, Mayra, it's okay if I speak about you in this anecdote. Some years ago, I ran into a situation where the university was very much fighting me. This has happened more than once. I had to go up for tenure with a lawyer. So for anybody out there who thinks that that they're the only ones, you're not. I can assure you, you're not. My partner, Brian Masumi, was at one point banned from teaching. And so I often think we relay the work. And so this is a story of relay. I had a student who ended up, you know, the end of the story is he ended up winning the dissertation award. But before he won the dissertation award, he was banned from defending his dissertation. I was his supervisor on the basis that I wasn't able to recognize knowledge. And in that instance, which was certainly not the first instance of my being sidelined for the kind of work that I do around facilitating neurodiversity, I went to see the dean and I said to her that I couldn't continue teaching at an institution if I couldn't be sure that the students I was working with were protected. And I wrote a paper, which is called Me lo dijo un pajarito, which I put out on Facebook. At the time, I was still on Facebook. I wrote the paper in the moment that I told the dean I was leaving the university. The paper was inspired by Mayra, who's sitting here purpling the screen. And Mayra was at the time, as she always is, thinking about how we learn together and talking about how odd it was that the forms of learning are always reducible to this idea of personhood that is so limited. But I was heartbroken. I wrote the paper in tears, you know, and then you wrote me. I had never met you. And you said, can I publish this? And I mention this because when you said that, I thought, oh, I'm not alone. And that's been my experience over years, that we actually make a difference when we relay. I didn't care about the publication. That wasn't the point. I cared that there was this other person I'd never met in South Africa who cared. And from there, you know, the story goes that the dean said to me, no, I'm not accepting your resignation. I need you to stay. And the student won the dissertation award. He did defend, and, you know, things didn't get all rosy. They didn't, you know, it's not like that. But I met you and I met other people, and today I'm sitting here. So I just say this because I don't think it's easy, but I think that it's not a question whether we do this work. We do this work because it's the only way to do the work.
Yeah. That was quite significant. I really loved that piece, and I was so pleased to have it included in our book. So it was really fortuitous. I'm getting on to the third question, which is about method, which you've written a whole chapter about, and your piece from CriSTaL is very much about metamodeling or schizoanalysis. So can you tell us a little bit about why you're against method, and what are, you know, what is alternatives? What have you used?
Yeah, so I'm very aware that I have publishing privilege, and so that the things that I say are not true for many scholars, maybe even most radically social science scholars, are those who are trying to be published in those contexts. And so I want to also, really reinforce that work can happen in relay across different constituencies. And what I'm trying to do is give us a vocabulary to fight, but I'm aware that nobody can fight that fight alone, especially not a younger scholar. What brought me to write that chapter was actually a group of students. I was directing our interdisciplinary PhD. This was around 2012 or so. And the students were asking for methods courses, and I was horrified. I thought, how did this happen that we have an interdisciplinary PhD and they're asking me for methods courses? Didn't my generation kill method? Have we been so unsuccessful? But at the same time, I felt like I understand that the students are asking for methods courses because they don't want to be shut out in terms of being employed. They're precarious. And so I thought, well, and then at the same time, I was getting requests around research creation and art-based practice to write about method. And again, I thought, how ridiculous is that? They're going to kill all the artists off. But I was also aware that the reason that this was happening was because artists were so precarious and so on. So I'm always aware of this. And at SenseLab, we talk about strategic duplicity and really try to recognize the places where a certain posture is necessary. You asked earlier on, how I get research grants was because I work really hard on them. They don't come naturally. And I know that I need to get money because the people that I work with need money to live and eat. And so I wrote against method as a kind of gesture to perhaps allow for a conversation that would protect students because they would have a citational field to pull from. And they could say, look, there are vocabularies that are in the philosophical tradition, like Alfred North Whitehead's vocabulary or Guattari's vocabulary, or others. We have other vocabularies like Donna Haraway or Karen Barad, or we have many vocabularies that we can pull from that can give us the confidence to begin to speak otherwise. And I had already developed a vocabulary of technique and technicity, and I wanted people to be able to recognize that by saying that I was against method, I wasn't saying that I was against technique. This has nothing to do with being against repetition or something like that. So that's where I began.
Thanks. You mentioned Karen Barad, and I noticed in your chapter that you talk about cuts of difference and actualization, and it did remind me of Barad's agential cut. And I do see many resonances in your work and hers. So I just wondered if anyone else had pointed that out, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate to meet Karen once and found her to be such a lively thinker across disciplines. It's a case of, I think that's where I betray myself as a philosopher, that my practice is one of returning to a few really key texts to me to just kind of extract concepts. And so I don't tend to have a very wide bibliography when I write, but that doesn't mean that I haven't read it. And so I honor the work that's coming out, and I think that Karen's work speaks very specifically to an art science conversation, and maybe connects also to the kind of work that Isabel Stengers did earlier on with Prigogine. Where I might differ from Karen is that I want to take the question of the agential slightly elsewhere. But even then, I hesitate even to say that, because I think that one of the things that can happen in academia that I've noticed I do is that when I'm close to a thinker, I've thought through our differences. you know, and so I could amplify a difference, which is actually such a similarity. And the last thing I would want to do is to put that very small field of women thinkers and philosophers into an antagonism. I would much rather say, you know, help us, help Karen and I figure out what our connections are, or help Rosie Braidotti and Karen and I figure out, or Donna Haraway, and maybe do that by asking what each of our questions are. So like, why does Donna Haraway moved to storytelling in the way she does? Or why does Karen Barad move to physics the way she does? Or why do you see what I'm saying? And I think you know exactly what I mean, but this is maybe to continue your question on method. What happens when we don't say this concept is this concept, and say instead, what kinds of operative questions are moving this thinker versus this thinker? And the last thing I'll say is that when I met Karen, what I understood, which I hadn't fully understood in her writing, which is maybe totally obvious to everybody except me, is that Karen's questions are very much gender questions. She's very much thinking about questions in the vocabulary of a new like a new thinking around sexuality. And I think that that's where I learn most from her work. And it's work that I would love to do. I've thought a lot about this kind of question. I just haven't gotten to it.
Thanks, that's very interesting. I just want to ask one last question pertaining to this. You've written about anarchiving and propositions, and I just wondered, how do they relate to each other, and how are they different, or are they the same sort of thing?
Oh, it's such a beautiful question. I've never thought about that. So in Whitehead, the proposition is defined as a lure for feeling. It's such a beautiful definition, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Whitehead, he calls his philosophy a critique of pure feeling, and that is in juxtaposition to Kant's critique of pure reason. And what Whitehead means by that is that his cosmology is moved by feeling. So it's another way, it's very close to vocabulary of affect, but Whitehead uses the word feeling. And what he's trying to foreground is that it isn't agentially motivated in a humanist encounter, that actually the pulse of affective resonance is what moves experience. The anarchive, so the proposition lives there. It is that conduit that allows feeling to erupt into a singularity of orientation. So when he talks about his allure for feeling, I really think of it as a kind of tunneling into a kind of precision of an orientation. Anarchiving, and I'll be really interested in what other folks here have to say about it, really came at Sense Lab. So the question of anarchiving for us, and I'm looking specifically at Mayra, who is one of the key thinkers of the early period around anarchiving, was the question of how we articulate what matters in an event. And so an event, in the process philosophical sense, is perhaps most simply defined as more than the sum of its parts. It is what exceeds the count. And what exceeds the count can't be archived. I mean, that's the irony of it. It can't be documented. How the hell would you document what exceeds the count in this conversation? It has something to do with affective resonance. It has something to do with the multiplicity of all of our points of departure today, and all of the weathers that are involved, and all of the COVIDs that we're living, and so on. And so the anarchive is really, we realized, a verb, right? I mean, we spent years failing at figuring out what an anarchive is, partly because it's a process of catching in the movement what matters in excess of process. And in that sense, you're absolutely right that it's propositional. I just never saw the connection. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. There is one last question about the university, and I think you have touched on it, but is there anything else you'd like to say about how we can make it a more conducive place, you know, for people doing work like you and the people you work with, like the ones that we have present here.
Yeah. I have two things I would say just quickly. And one of them is that, you know, when people in pedagogy and education started inviting me to speak, it was the biggest honor. I can't even articulate what a big honor it was, because it always felt to me that that's where the political was situated for me. But I don't have a background in education. My background is in philosophy and art. But it always seemed to me that the classroom was the place where I needed to do the work. And I come from a family of teachers, and I come from a very creative family of teachers. My father taught English in high school in a farm country, and recognized early on that the systems in education didn't work for particularly the boys who would be in the fields in the spring and would fail year after year after year because they missed months of school. And in the 70s and 80s, my father developed recording techniques, which I can now say were anarchival, that allowed them to continue their work in the fields. And so I grew up in that context of really creative thoughts around teaching, but also with a lot of skepticism. My father was incredibly discouraged with education when standard testing came in, and ended up leaving teaching, early retirement. My mother was a kindergarten teacher, and so worked with the children. And so this is the place from which I come, and I feel that the classroom is the place of relays. So the one thing I think that actually makes a difference is if we emphatically, literally support each other's students, which is to say, build networks of support around evaluation of our students. And I know we already do that, but I think that that's what has made it possible, that SenseLab has, you know, overall probably about 800 people. And that means that when a student needs to defend, we have resources, and that we work in strategic duplicity, recognizing that some of us, it just happens by academic luck, have facility with those kinds of practices that give us prestige. That doesn't mean we have more value. It just means we have those kinds of facility and that we support each other. And then the other thing that I would say is, you mentioned early on that the 3 ecologies is at work. And
I'm interested to find out.
So the 3 ecologies comes from Guattari, the idea that the transversality is necessary between the environment, the social, and the conceptual. And so SenseLab has been thinking really seriously for some years, a decade or so, about alter pedagogical environments for learning and or for study, in the sense that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney give the term, where you're always doing educational work, philosophical work, no matter what you're doing, whether you're swimming or planting or sleeping, whatever you're doing. And so we're in the last stages of purchasing a site here in north of Montreal, which will, you know, launch probably. We haven't done a formal announcement of this, but I would think in the next few weeks, and where we will be doing another kind of relay, which is equally important to me, which is to say that a lot of the people that I learned from are excluded from university because they're non-speaking autistic and or other forms of neurodiversity or precarity that doesn't allow for them to participate. And so I think that we need to have those kinds of relays where those of us who have that interest can work outside the accreditation systems, but in alternative pedagogy, in order to also honor those forms of practice. And what that means is that you know, what I hope for are more and more publications that are not predicated on your institutional status.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. And we sort of looking at another webinar series on neurodiversity. So perhaps it'll be a little bit down the way, and it would be so lovely to have you there as well, because I know that that is a huge interest of yours, and you've written a lot about it.
Yeah.
But I'm dying to get on now and include everyone here on the screen. I've been very conscious of people not participating. So can I just introduce all of your students? I'm going to start with Halbe. Halbe Kuipers is a PhD candidate at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, and also working with Sense Lab Experimental Laboratory, which we've heard about. His research concerns itself with pedagogies of seeing, perspectivism, and questions of ethics through process philosophy. He's been the editor for the journal Inflections, which is a very lovely journal, I must say, and is in the process of publishing articles on the intersection of neurodiversity and pedagogy. Mayra Morales is a Montreal-based Mexican artist, currently pursuing a PhD in dance philosophy and research creation at Concordia University. Mayra holds an MA in dance theatre from La Bonne in London and has taught experimental dance, choreography, and philosophy at universities for 13 years. And she collaborates at the Sense Lab. Her own artistic and philosophical research investigates choreography as an environmental practice and is centered in the relation between movement and thought through a proposition of mobile architectures for interminable landscapes, with a special interest in exploring emergence of differential dimensions for becoming's expressivity. Diego Gil is a choreographer, performer, and philosopher who studied at the Amsterdam School for New Dance Development, DAS choreography, and also holds a PhD at the Interdisciplinary Humanities Program of Concordia University. The title of the thesis is a study on the intervals of perception and the architectures of experience towards schizosomatics. He combines the study of somatic processes with practices with process philosophy to think alternative spaces for research creation specific for the performing arts. Sounds very interesting what all of you do. And I just wondered if you would each like to just to say a little bit more about what you do and how it has related to the questions that we've been posing. Who would like to start? Halbe.
Yeah, I think I can start. Why not? I mean, there is a lot to say. Yeah, about all these things, but maybe one point to start is, since I'm also now in the middle of it, maybe you can see from the surrounding that I'm at, which is also a particularly important thing for me, because after being stuck in the Netherlands for a year, I finally got to be able to come back to Montreal and continue
That's
the work
fortunate.
I'm doing here. Yeah, it was incredible. Getting stuck through COVID is not a very nice thing. Even though I was fortunate enough to be near to my family, being at removal of the space where you're working is not a pleasant thing. But in any case, so for instance, the space that's now surrounding me, this is I'm actually in the basement of a house that we've been working in with Sense Lab for the past 3 years, I think it is now, or so. which was actually just a simple proposition. It was a proposition for how to live otherwise, mostly tending to neurodiverse sensibilities. But this space is actually reactivated this week. So we've been working really hard to create a space again wherein bodies can land, can just compose, have a place to work. And of course, all the while thinking about all the conditions that are there with COVID. So how do we do this with the distancing? How do we do it in ways that it's still safe? And but in any case, yeah, what I wanted to say about this space and the way study, because if there's one thing that I've learned in the past years, is that, at least for me, and I think for many other bodies, that the studying is always so much more than merely the writing or merely the reading. So it comes with an entire environment. And I think that what we're doing here, for instance, with this environment, which is just one experiment, and there's many different versions of it and iterations. But this is a sort of experiment of what it is to create a space where the bodies can go around and have their ways of playing, composing. So it's very much like like a classroom for children, a playground. But then attuned to all different materials that we have. So I can show you a bit more around.
Thanks.
It's a bit of a strange space, but it's very gorgeous at the moment. We've just created a bit of an environment to be around. But so the important thing for me here is just, so when I was locked out the past year, what I noticed in trying to do the writing again, because you would think like, oh, it's easy to do the writing. I have all the time in the world now. I mean, I can't go anywhere, so I'll just stay home and write. But it turned out to be the most difficult thing ever. And I was not able to write anything, or at least nothing that had a particular feeling to it. And now coming back into this and these conditions, it just makes so clear to me again what the relevance is of our environment of study. So I think this is just one tiny example of that. But yeah, we've been doing a lot around that and trying to work on these conditions. Oh, and I can also add, by the way, that Mayra, who is down there, is, for instance, upstairs. So in part of this whole building that we have as an experiment, the house itself has always, from the beginning, as proposition, in How to Live Otherwise, has always also shifted its conditions. So it holds very little of a sense of an individual house or a house for individuals. So it has changed its setting and its composition in terms of the people also continuously. So it's an ongoing experiment, which is not an easy experiment, especially these days, that's for sure. Because we used to be able to shift a lot, but that's impossible. But yeah.
Do you live there too? I mean, are you there? Is that where you live?
Yeah. It's also for living. Yeah.
Great.
So it's really a whole.
Sounds ideal.
Well, ideal, I don't know. But it's quite wonderful. Yeah. And it's a beautiful experiment for different sensibilities.
It looks very colorful.
Yeah, it changes every week almost, but yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Halbe. Would somebody else like to go? Maya or Diego?
Yeah, what to say? Yeah, maybe in composition with environment and spaces that that is something that the Sense Lab I feel has been working since really long on how to create an environment where like learning almost happens by itself. And these environments sometimes are really rooms that exist, like, you know, like we had the room at the Sense Lab, which now we cannot access, and now we have the new Andre space, is how we call it, where Halbe is. But those rooms also, they are thresholds and they are transversal and they are like in the moving. And for that, I give you an example of, I think the first time that I started to learn what it was to be a student in process philosophy. Though I mean, in my background, I come from dance, but I started to study dance and philosophy at the same time at the age of 18, more or less. So I have a background on philosophy. But the very first time that I felt like, okay, I think I'm getting process philosophy was being in Australia, actually, being in Melbourne. And was it Melbourne, Mayra, that we were sharing a house there for an event? Was our first kind of international event on the project of immediations. And then we went to a room, and then it happened that we were living together. We had to share the room with Mayra and Chenge Koloshvari, Ramona Benveniste, and by living together and having insomnia together and been talking about the concepts that we were activating around the immediations project, as the concept of immediation, what it means to be immediate on the experience. Like, I realized that on all that moments that I was like almost losing attention and I was just, chit-chatting, etc., like learning was really happening, and it was really diagramming in a way, like almost like a texture was felt. You could read Erin on that, on the notion of the diagram, the biogram, also on Brian about the biogrammatic experience or synesthetic experience. So that's also like a space of learning, environment of learning that was not, contained into the rooms in a way, but it was like, was really carried by the concepts, by the care of the bodies moving, etc. So in composition to those spaces, I think maybe the most, interesting experience that I can talk of is the Schizomatic series that we organized together with a visual artist and somatic practitioner, Chenge Koloshvari again. So there was this 1 year period that the space, the environment to learn in the Sense Lab itself, when it was, that was 2018, it was still open. So the space was doing a lot of stuff, like creating different thresholds for bodies to enter and to study and to not feel discouraged, like you have to enter with certain knowledge or certain kind of ableism, Then we created this Schizomatic series, and we were inviting people with a kind of performative art practice, somatic practices, and we were asking them to bring something like a technique, again, following Erin, but that technique should be skis, like going to the concept of the skis, which is this concept of the lesson Guattari, and that means that it needs to be kind of like, skis is kind of like it's a certain kind of division, or like like not chunkiness, but something like, it needs to be on the threshold. It should be something unfinished in a way. It should be something on germ, but it's something in germ, also already coupling with something else in germ. So it's kind of, it's like something, it's like it's something like connected with something else, but it's not really connecting yet. It's not really grown itself. So we were asking, to bring, not to bring techniques in which we, techniques that were closed on itself, and then that the experimentation will be infinite. Like sometimes I always give the example of a meditation technique. Sometimes meditation techniques are infinite on their result and effect, but kind of like you come with a technique and you know that you have to sit for 10 minutes and breathe or have a mentalization as such and as such in a way. So we're thinking, really bring something that you think is a technique, but it's really undone yet. It's like it's on its way. And then from there, we were working with this notion of the schizosomatic body. So notions of kind of what is the more than body, or how a body is made. And at least for me, it was very important to understand the body beyond the anatomical configuration, physiological configuration, which I think sometimes somatic practices are really based on aligning kind of like your proprioceptive experience into a kind of physiology or anatomy. And I think there is always something very exciting about opening maps, but also like kind of making the body again efficient, and then like going into the use of care in the body, but a little more than following into this neoliberal use of caring. But I love these techniques, so it's like, okay, how can we still use them and like kind of bring this anarchic thing that is this going on? So that was the most interesting for me, like using process philosophy to think about the incorporealities of bodies, how, or you could also think with Deleuze and Guattari corporeality as the transversal itself. So like you are always meeting portions of corporealities that, which are transversal, and that's the body, if you want. So you never really have a body as a human in a way, but you're always like seeding bodies and meeting bodies. And that was a very, I think, very nice and kind of like successful of in this sense of way that there was a dialogue between making spaces and making bodies on the spaces. Just because also all the techniques that were invited to be shared, they were kind of like in dialogue with all the work of the space that was being around. So yeah, I stopped there.
And did you write about that in your thesis then?
Yeah, finally. But again, you know, that's the way that we study the sense of, I never thought that I would write about it. But then as I was writing, I realized that that's what is happening in a way, and that's where the desire was, and a very, you know, what Erin allow us kind of is like you really kind of in a way you really forget about the big picture of the university, and then you really find something that is really exciting but traveling you again, and then you really start in that small thing, you know, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm writing about the corporeal as a transversal thing, and how that has a schizo effect, and how that could be kind of a sort of alter therapeutic in a way, you know, like a kind of like a source of vitality affect in a way, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating. And it seems like it's been going on for some time, and that you have sort of established. I didn't realize that you were also connected. But I would like to go on and give Maya a chance before we go to questions. Otherwise, we're going to be running out of time.
Yes. Hi. I will try to. I will try to be brief. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So two things. First, I'm really thankful that Halbe and Diego were first. Otherwise, I would just be like totally mute, because this is one of the things that I would like to say, that sometimes we move with assumptions that thought is just there and that we are ready. And for myself, I have come to learn a lot about neurodiverse thought and how it really participates in the ways that we think much more than we would assume. And so a lot of times I can get this kind of panics of like, oh my God, I have no idea what to say about myself. Like, I really don't know. Because in a way, thought is a kind of environment and ecological. So if it doesn't have, it's like a dough, right? So if it doesn't have a process to get going, then it just gets dried. And sometimes that's how I feel. So I think a lot that Halbe and Diego were good massagers of the dough. So now it feels really nice. And so I wanted to share, for example, thinking processes. These are my holders. So I take notes a lot, but they're not notes, they're forms of listening. So if I do not do a double action, it's very difficult for me to do just a simple action. So these are things that I have come to learn at a PhD. I should have learned them in primary school, perhaps, right? But education has been so organized that then I'm just glad that I had the opportunity to be learning that there are other ways of learning, and that thought manifests in many, many different ways. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that I also come from a place where school and life was always very mingled. So my parents started a Montessori school and built it. And eventually, honestly, we were leaving, and my mother started at school in the first floor of the house. So to go to the kitchen, you would always have to go through a class and kind of like cross through there. And I grew up with that as a very normal thing. And with the years, I came to see that that was very radical, actually. And so I think my journey has brought me here to the Sense Lab, and with beautiful collaborators that are also in a way trying to understand how to mingle more what has become so separated because of an assumption of how things function separately. So you have your living place and then you go to your study place. And as Halbe says, it's not really that easy. It always comes with frictions and tensions, but it is very nice to really explore the idea of like how to live otherwise. And it just makes me think about the concept of the book room, which is also like this beautiful concept of how to mingle things that may apparently be separated. So how is it that a book can be a room or a room can be a book? I'm really very excited about thinking those questions. And as a dancer coming toward philosophy, I've been very excited to think the philosophical force in a lot of the expressive manifestations. So really to think the body, or like, you know, some compositions, to think them with a charge of philosophical thought and not necessarily as totally separated. And perhaps just to finish, this reminds me of a moment when I was in a conference and I gave a performance, and someone asked me, how do you move from from your research questions, how do you develop a choreographic work? And the question totally, I couldn't work with that question. And later on, I thought that it is because I never have research questions before I have a work. That just seemed impossible. And so, and I don't even have work if I don't leave. So what happens in my process is that I go for a walk, and then the walk becomes the choreography. So it's been really a work to understand that sometimes it works backwards, and that the choreography is in the kitchen, and that the choreography is in the dream, and in the tics and in the movements that we're trying to deal with while swimming. And so I would say that that would be my work, better than my short bio that you read. Yes.
Thank you so much. You've all made the Sense Lab come so much alive, I think. I've always tried to imagine what it must be like, but it's been so interesting to hear. And I'm hoping that you'll be available, all of you, for the questions that are coming. We've got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to hand over to Candace and Erin, and let's hear what questions are coming for all of you.
As a reminder to all of those who are in attendance today, if you find the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, you can type your question in there. Erin Price and I will try our best to get through as many as possible. So I'll start with the first one, and then we'll just keep moving through them as time permits. And these questions are for all four of you, so you can kind of decide who might want to answer which one, and just think of it as a conversation. So we have one question that states, imminent critique reminds me of Sedgwick's reparative reading from touching feeling. How does imminent critique complement or supplement this concept? In particular, I'm wondering if and how it articulates divergences between Deleuze-Guattarian ontological affect and one with more psychoanalytical theoretical origins.
You guys, should I start with this? Mel, I think it's such a great question. And I think that definitely there are really interesting ways to move between the reparative reading and the immanent critique. As is clear from your question, you're familiar with the different histories of affect going into Sedgwick's work and going into the more Spinozist realms. So there will be a stronger sense in the Tompkins notion of affect with an internalization of the affective, which also tends toward a more humanist reading. What you'll find in the Spinozist affective side is the withdrawal of that humanism, as I was explaining earlier. And I think that the main difference is that Deleuze and Guattari move toward the schizoanalytic, which really tries to withdraw from any idea of transference, and which means that it breaks down, and or not even just breaks down, it breaks up, it explodes the idea of that triangulation, aiming toward another geometric or topological figure, which is that of transversality. I'm a trained psychoanalyst, so I always think that, as I said before, it's not so interesting to me to make camps. It's more interesting to me to ask the question of how the work is moving you to where you need to be to think. And I think that Sedgwick moves us very much in an arena where we can think, if we're trying to think through the kinds of issues that she's opening up, and that she was opening up in a very important way in the period that she was opening them up. What I love about schizoanalysis as opposed to psychoanalysis is that it allows, it first of all creates an opening for neurodiversity that is simply not there in psychoanalysis. It for all kinds of reasons that would take too long for me to articulate. Saying that, I don't mean that psychoanalysts can't deal with neurodiversity. Of course they can. But there's a question of how the theoretical operations of psychoanalysis organize themselves in neurotypical ways, and that would be a bigger conversation. So what I would say is that when we're doing reparative readings, particularly in the context of the university, it might be important, or it would be important for us to ask ourselves whether those reparative readings foreground neurotypicality. And in my recent work, and for Pragmatics of the Useless, I make a strong connection between whiteness and neurotypicality. So asking how these systemic operations facilitate the reorganization of certain modes of value that are operative within the institution. And so what I mean by that is that we have to, I think, be careful whenever we do any kind of reading, that we don't further cement modes of internal and external binary. And I think you could do that with any kind of theorists on your back. So it's not really a question of wearing the theorist backpack so much as doing what I heard Halbe and Diego and Mayra talking about in making the philosophy your practice.
Thank you, Erin. Our next question has to do with radical empiricism. And this is, again, for everyone or anyone. The question presenter asks if you can describe the relationship between anarchiving and radical empiricism, or radical empiricism and any other related ideas that have been discussed today.
I can say something maybe to get started, and maybe Erin, Mayra, or Ache, you can continue. But I don't know, the first thing that it came to me when I read Radical Empiricism, of course, is William James. which we have been reading now during the COVID. We have a reading group on the book of David Lapouchade on empiricism. How is the name of the? I don't remember. Someone should put it there again. But again, this feeling that I think HH and Mayra say that all of a sudden you find yourself in the doing or in the study. That's to be in the middle of the empiricism somehow, of the radical empiricism. So that means that that is like an empirical event in a way that is real and is concrete, but again, it's not limited to the concrete stuff, but kind of like there has been a lot of motors or in the vocabulary of Deleuze and Guattari, machinic desire coming through the interstices in a minor way that has done that moment, the moment of a study, very concretely happening. And that can happen again in the kitchen, in the space, sharing a room in Melbourne, in the moment that was not the moment of the event, in a way. So in a way, it's very simple, in a way. It's very simple, very contingent, in a way, but it's not limited to this idea of contingency of, it's just matter of fact of what happens, in a way. And I think there is a lot of that on the other text that you post, Erin, on the way that things shape each other, how decision is matter of fact, but actually the way that the decision is formed through the processes, it carries a level of abstraction in a sense of a level of not being just concrete, but being abstract or virtual, but super real as well, in a way. So that's the first thing about radical empiricism. And in the connection with the anarchive will be, okay, yeah, so then how do you continue that empiricism without killing the charge of the abstraction of the decision? So that empirical thing that happens keeps relaying on the future through that oxygen on the abstract of the decision. No? Mayra?
Maybe I can continue a little bit from there. And also it's something that I've been thinking all day today, because I had to substitute an elementary teacher, and I'm like, oh no, now I'm gonna talk about ancient Egypt. And I was like, no, I should just talk about philosophy, because that's what I've been, like, that's what I can do. And what I was thinking while I was walking was what can I ask the question, the kids, philosophically, that takes us to philosophical thought? And I just thought, okay, I think I want to ask them to think of a tree. And so that was like, okay, let's think together of a tree. Because I wanted to ask the question of nature right away. Like, okay, how do I introduce process philosophy to children? And so I think nature, it has to be nature. So I thought, if we think a tree, then I will ask the kids, and also with a lot of curiosity, how is it happening for them, this thinking? What is it to think a tree? Like, what is that process? And very rapidly, I was enjoying more the exercise myself than whatever was going to happen anyway. And I just thought, is this kind of, William James talks a lot about consciousness and thinking, not as a separated thing from the world, but actually as totally, I'm using a lot the word mingle this morning, never again before, but as totally mingled with experience. So thought, experience, nature, the tree is not just a particle that is there for you to look from the outside, but it is actually inflicting your experience of thinking the tree, and thinking the tree is inflicting the experiencing tree as well. So experience in this way is not something that happens to a human body that perceives that way. So I was thinking about that kind of continuum in terms of experience and nature and thought, but thought in the world and the human body of the world, instead of being a nature and a human, but also the thinking capacity as being a capacity that nature carries. So I was thinking that not separation. I was thinking about the concept of um, um, difference without separation from Denise Ferreira da Silva, which always takes us to the concept of relation that I, for some reason, started calling compositionality. But more and more, I fall in love with relation as a concept that takes me there faster. And so I think that so much more is happening in experience and in reality than what you could just say, it's this or it's that, what you can point. So Erin always has a phrase that is whatever happens, happens. Whatever is affecting in the room, whatever has taken an effect is happening. So that is reality, and that is the radical pragmatism, that it is not your point of view or my point of view or the tree's point of view or a human perspective point of view. So there's much more mingling relation going on. And also a lot is going on at the abstract level. So I always think of this example that you give, Erin, about like couples. So you're in the room in the morning and you say, what's happening? And your partner says, nothing is happening. But of course, something has happened. So I say that this is a radical pragmatism. Yes,
Yes.
somewhere there.
So we have another question if we're okay to move on. This is a question around experimental sites of pedagogical innovation. So this was directed to Erin, but of course, if others want to chime in as well. We have an attendee who's interested in hearing more about your views on future pedagogies in education, especially alongside young people who currently reside in the school system, and especially as the pandemic is opening up these new spaces of possibility for learning everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are many, many more people who are here in this webinar who have far more experience than I do in that environment. So I'm a student of that question, really. I think Nini might be in attendance, and I was lucky enough to be in Norway with Nini and learn a little bit about their Sandvik, learn a little bit about their pedagogical work with children. What I can say is that a year ago, just before the pandemic hit, Sense Lab started something called Play Care at Underspace. So Underspace is what Halbe was showing, where you see Halbe and Mayra, and it's a city-based sort of relay toward the three ecologies, which was built out of a proposition to house people who couldn't, who needed a place to land. So the idea was, what if we moved into apartments that had just a little bit more space than we needed, so that we could always welcome somebody? And instead of thinking about space as something that we all have to have neutrally outside of us, like we need to rent a space outside. And one of the reasons for that was because if we add more spaces, and I'll get to the question of children in a second, but if we add more spaces, each one of us has to leave the place where we live in order to go there, and it adds more work to our days. But what if we amalgamated a little bit like Mayra's, walking through the classroom into the kitchen? What if we amalgamated it? And so we started what we called Play Care in Underspace in January last year. And the idea was really to learn how to play from the children. Our sense was that there were quite a few children in Montreal who were neurodiverse, or children of immigrants who had issues, troubles, difficulties getting their children into daycare. And we were interested in seeing what would happen if we opened up the space one day a week. And we decided that we would also have a cricket farm, and see if we could go with the crickets from the crickets to the food. So all the way through a life cycle. COVID hit, so our experiment was stopped. We only managed to do it for 3 months. But what I learned through that is that there is definitely it taught me something really important, which was that in our thinking about the three ecologies and the alter pedagogical practices we want to engage in, it's never going to be about school in the sense of bringing adults together. It's always going to be about intergenerational learning and teaching. And the place from which we want to learn is there, where we're in the kitchen cooking, and when we're playing and drawing and watching the kids and disagreeing with them. I mean, these particular kids were completely uninterested in crickets, it turns out, and only the adults were interested in crickets. And also then losing our own presuppositions about what children like and what children don't like, and so on. And I say this, I don't mean to be flippant. Most of the folks around Sense Lab are neurodiverse, and many of them have neurodiverse children, and the school that exists today is not a place that is welcoming toward most of those children. And so these are really pragmatic questions, and I think as we move toward the land, these are questions that we'll be able to ask more. Mayra is home right now, homeschooling her son for these very reasons, and has all this experience. So maybe, Mayra, you have something specific you wanted to say. I don't want to put you on the spot, though.
No, I think that it is a very, very important question. I do think that the educational system is suffocated nowadays. I don't say that lightly. I think at the university, like really, what would it be to really understand that writing is not only, as Halbe said, to have the time to do it. Oh, but you have all this time. Now it's the perfect time. And it turns out that it doesn't work that way. When are we really willing to go all the way to the understanding that it works differently and that different environments are needed, and that for some reason environment experience in its complexity, which is what creates a life. And we do need a life in order to learn. The online learning for the kids is that they just couldn't do it. It's a lot for the teachers. It's really not asking the question. It's just transporting one suffocating system to the screen, right? But a lot of people are taking this very seriously. And I do think that it is a project to think education otherwise, intergenerationally, to think it in terms of like what happens in the kitchen matters, to think it in really questioning evaluation. Like, can we really get rid of evaluation? What is that doing to the psychology? And then also can we move away from accreditation? These are hard because it's like, yeah, but this is what attracts, this is what people is asking for. This is what gives security. But I always have this question, is it really? So yeah, can we get together and invent other spaces that take us to creating life for living? And the concept from Pragmatics of the Useless that I love, loving living. So loving not as just we're all together and we're happy, right? But loving living as these strong ways of creating life every day, again and again, in a way that we can start integrating and taking care of young kids, not only as these things that have to be taken care for and given information, but to really care for learning processes that will give them the capacity for life living and loving living, which is right now super necessary and relevant. I think that's what I would say.
Maybe if I can add like a tiny bit, because I know we probably don't have much time, but I think what both Erin and Mayra are pointing at so strongly is that I guess I mean, this is just an experiment, of course, and it's in no way gonna teach us how to all do it all better, but there's something so important about seeing what the cost is of how we are doing things. Because when things slip into their habitual mode of doing, into their methods, we might start to fail to see what the cost is for our bodies, for the children, their bodies. I mean, Mayra was telling me this morning beautifully about her sister and then how they've gorgeously set up this space with their Montessori pedagogy and the children. It's really amazing to hear that. But then at the same time, it's also so hard to hear what the cost is for the particular bodies. And what happens when we really fail to see what all these shifts are doing. So what is this doing to us that now all of a sudden we're all on webinars and behind the Zoom? I mean, everyone has this question, of course. I mean, it's everywhere. But I mean, to really look at what the cost of these things are and to shift the work so that we can continuously keep that cost, at least not to just fully grab our bodies and to descend in these complete depressions, but just about enough elbow room. I think that's everything.
Yeah. And just to add a little bit of to that, Halbe, I think there is never going to be one enough experiment. So I guess the dream for me is that we all start experimenting ASAP, and so we do it together, because what I see is that some bodies take on some of the hard work of thinking it strongly and taking the time, but the cost is high. But that cost could really be distributed if more were on the task. You know, more people could take naps while other people would relay. And I think Erin said it very beautifully about the relaying. So how do we relay the experiment so that we can work hard, but also nap as much as we need?
Yeah.
Well, I know that we are close to time. We had one last question, so I wondered, Erin, if you might ask it, if it might just be some closing thoughts. That might not be possible with this question. But Erin Price, do you want to ask the question and see if there is some thoughts around that to end the webinar? And then I'll make sure that I kind of wrap this up at the end before we say goodbye.
Sure. There's a question about the philosophical force that comes about or lives in dance. Could you speak about dance and affect and what dance has taught you?
So I know we're running short on time. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to really suggest that people contact Mayra and Diego. Diego is actually graduated. He's not a student anymore. And Diego's PhD was just one of the most extraordinary PhDs on philosophy and dance. Not on philosophy and dance, philosophying and dancing. And Mayra is very close to finishing her own. It's just that Mayra doesn't understand beginning and ending. So she finished it like 6 years ago, but she keeps beginning and ending it forever. But she has so much. And, you know, I learned so much from Diego and Mayra, both really extraordinary choreographers. So if you guys are fine with that, I would really suggest people contact them. And I wrote in the text that if you email the 3 Ecologies Institute at gmail.com, we all get it. So if you say, I want Diego's thesis, he'll get it. And then he can send it to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Erin. That's a great So that if you haven't checked out the emails and the ways to get in contact, you can scroll through the chat box to find that. Viv, do you want to have some closing thoughts?
To say thank you so much to all of you. It's been such a rich conversation, and I've certainly learned a huge amount from all of you. And I'm very keen to read all of your work. I think that we've also touched on things that are worrying all of us in terms of being overloaded in the pandemic. And Mayra, I liked your proposition that some of us need to nap while others take things on. And I just wanted to thank you, Erin, for bringing everyone to us, because it's made it so much richer. And yeah, to hear all of you talk so eloquently about these things. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank all of you. Just having, I hope it's clear, at least once you've heard these exquisite creatures speak, that nothing I've ever written was written by myself alone.